Public inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal described as the worst ever NHS treatment disaster begins this week. It's going to look at how NHS patients came to be given infected blood products during the 1970s and the 1980s as well.
The inquiry is due to start tomorrow. It will be led by Sir Brian Langstaff and is expected to last 2 years. It's been long fought for. The Mayor of Manchester and former Health Secretary Andy Burnham pushed for it, saying the scandal had been a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale.
Theresa May announced an inquiry in the Commons in July 2017.
The victims and their families have suffered pain and hardship, and they deserve answers, and the inquiry will give them those answers so they will know why this happened, how it happened. This was an appalling tragedy and it should never have happened.
Thousands of people with haemophilia and other bleeding disorders were infected with HIV and hepatitis viruses over a period of more than 20 years. Around about 2,500 of them have since died.
They were injected with blood products to help with clotting disorders, but because the UK was struggling to keep up with demand for treatment, it had begun to import supplies from the US. Now, some of this imported blood came from high-risk sources, including prison inmates in America, and people were being paid for it as well. It's thought as many as 30,000 people may have been infected. It is just extraordinary. It is an absolute scandal. Sue Threakall lost her husband Bob in 1991. Sue, good morning to you.
Good morning.
And Des Collins is a senior partner at Collins Solicitors, which is representing more than 1,000 victims and their families. Hello, Mr. Collins.
Good morning.
Sue, I bet there are days when you still cannot believe that this happened.
Yeah, there are. But, I mean, there are more days when I can't believe that we're still fighting. It's 30-odd years on. This should have and could have been sorted decades ago. I actually think there are two scandals here. The first one is what happened in the first place, which led to around 5,000 haemophiliacs being infected with multiple viruses. And the second scandal has been perpetrated by every government since then that has forced the victims to fight on for truth and justice. And I think there is something fundamentally wrong in a country where this happens again and again to groups of victims. So, yeah, I mean, that's the overriding thought. I mean, I've got used to the fact that it happened. That bit happened years and years ago, but I still can't get used to the fact that we are being put through this again and again and again in order to get the truth.
Des Collins, what is the evidence that this carried on after the authorities, the government, the health advisors knew the risks?
There's a huge amount of evidence which has come out into the public piecemeal over a period of about 35 years. Largely in more recent times it's come from freedom of information requests where government papers had been lodged in the National Archive, and we've been successful in dragging them out of the National Archive and trying to piecemeal the history together. But there is overwhelming evidence, and I think it's in the light of that overwhelming evidence that Theresa May last year or 2 years ago decided that time was up, effectively, and a public inquiry had to be announced.
Some people say it's ignorance. Others ascribe to it far more sinister motives in the sense of carrying this on to see what would happen. And, of course, there were international agreements way back saying nobody will be experimented on medically without their consent. Can I delve into that one with you, Des Collins?
Yes, by all means. The reason why victims were tested without consent is a long and very complex one, but essentially there was no one interfering with that treatment, and because no one was supervising, interfering, or in taking control of that treatment, the examination of the records show that, for example, one doctor, one group of medics would decide it was a good idea, and no one stood behind them at any moment in time and said, hang on, guys, you can't do that. They just carried on. One decision led to another, led to another, led to another, and before we knew where we were back in the day, it was wholesale. And it's that failure to have restraint, failure to have checks and balances in the system, which allowed the situation to develop as it did.
Sue, I want to ask you about Bob in a second, obviously, but just to establish something else, Des, I was reading that in France, the former health secretary was convicted of manslaughter, wasn't jailed, but the former head and deputy head of the blood transfusion service was sent to prison. This was going on all over the world, in Canada in particular as well, and in Japan. But in America, the pharma companies there have paid out millions in court settlements. So why not here?
There has been no effective litigation in this country on this issue for about 20 or 25 years. The main action which was conducted was at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. And that action ended up in a compromise whereby the victims, not knowing what the true facts were, and I hasten to say that is quite clear, were allowed to enter into a settlement. Now, part of that settlement
was an ex gratia settlement, wasn't it?
An ex gratia settlement whereby they would never cross the door of the Department of Health again and commence proceedings. And it is that proviso in the settlement agreement which has stopped any constructive or real litigation taking place in this country. Now, that position changed literally weeks before the public inquiry was announced in this country, and that in the early part of July 2017, the victims got together and launched a group action in the High Court. And it's not without significance that within days of that group action having been launched, that the Prime Minister announced the public inquiry. Now, that group action is continuing. It will continue, although it's been put on ice pending the outcome of the inquiry. It will continue, and it will demonstrate that compensation and not ex gratia payments should be made to the victims and their families.
Yeah, my understanding is that ex gratia payments were made, and with the understanding that nothing more was said, basically, but then new information came about, and the argument was that all the information hadn't been made available on the dangers, and also what people knew about the dangers. But it's extraordinary, isn't it? These people who needed money gave this blood, chaotic lives, drug addicts, sex workers, alcoholics. Sue, tell us about Bob, and tell us what happened to Bob.
Bob was basically just an ordinary family man, but he was a severe haemophiliac who'd had to basically fight for everything that he got. He wasn't allowed in a normal school in common with the policies at the time because of his haemophilia, so he had to go to a special school. When he left school with no qualifications, he then took himself off to night school and got what he needed to join the civil service, ironically. Crept his way up there, did very well, loved his job. He'd been married before. By the time I met him, he was divorced. He got 2 sons. When we got married, they came to live with us, and everything seemed fine. He'd had hepatitis B just before we married, and there was a very casual attitude by the doctors. Oh, yeah, this is the sort of thing that you can expect. This kind of goes with the territory of having factor products. He wasn't happy about that, obviously. Yes, he appeared to get over it, but I do remember that he was very, very reluctant to use the factor products and to inject himself. And on one occasion, I remember saying, for goodness sake, if it's so painful, why don't you inject? And he said, well, you don't know what's in it. Now, if he could work that out as a relative layman, based on the knowledge he had at the time, it begs the question, well, what did they know? Anyway, we then went on to have our son in 1983. And in 1985, he, along with, I think, all the other haemophiliacs, at the hospital where we were living, was tested for HIV and was called in some time later, quite a lot of time later, actually.
Back then there was such a stigma.
Oh, it was horrendous, and I don't think it was accidental. Every time you turn the television on, there were crumbling icebergs and people chucking axes at blocks of concrete, and it was all AIDS, don't die of ignorance. We had an eminent politician at the time saying, good, clean Christian people don't get AIDS.
Who was that? Do you remember?
Yeah, I know exactly who he was, but you told me not to name names.
Oh, okay. You've had other instructions. Well, let's go with that then. Yeah. We also had
again, eminent politicians saying things like the life of a haemophiliac is very expensive to maintain, and then went on to discuss the cost implications once a few of them had died. And a few of them certainly did start dying. It was virtually 1 or 2 funerals a week, you know, and the men used to go to the local clinic and they'd look around the room and obviously we're thinking, well, when's it my turn? When am I next? And they knew the signs, you know, they knew what to look for. They knew when somebody was going downhill. There was very little support. A lot of the families, not us, but a lot of the families suffered dreadful stigma and had things like AIDS scum written all over the front of their house. That they had. Well, I know one gentleman who had his house burned down. People had to move home. People were told that their children who were haemophiliacs could no longer attend the local primary schools, regardless of whether or not they'd been infected with anything. If you were a haemophiliac in those days, as far as the general public was concerned, you had AIDS, you were going to infect everyone, you were going to die. It was as simple as that.
Well, just appalling, just disgusting. By the way, if you want to know those names, many of the names that we are being very cautious about are on the public record, and you can find them pretty easily. People who worked in the Ministry of Health, people who said those outrageous things, and also people who were ministers at the time. You can find it with a little bit of a Google. Des Collins, just finally, and just a thought on this. Was this profit over people or ignorance over knowledge?
Insofar as the pharma companies were concerned, it was certainly profit over people. They realised that this was a wonder drug. It could be sold, not a drug, it was a plasma-derived product, but it was going to be regarded as a lifesaver for haemophiliacs across the world, and they were quite determined to market it vigorously, and they did. And once it became apparent that there were problems, they ignored them.
Thank you very much. Sue Threakall, who lost her husband Bob in 1991, and Des Collins, senior partner at Collins Solicitors, representing more than 1,000 victims and their families.